Hi and welcome back. Today I'm going to be painting an evening seascape, quite calm and tranquil. A fishing boat returning with its catch being trailed by a flock of seagulls, with maybe a couple of distant boats and just a very quiet but atmospheric sky, trying to show nightfall but with that last gleam of daylight still showing. I'm using Saunders Waterford cold pressed paper. It's taped to my board and my board's at an angle of about 45 degrees, and I'm going to paint wet in wet to start with. So I'm starting by painting a very loose wet in wet sky, starting with raw sienna and then indigo, Prussian blue, Payne's grey and burnt umber, spread across the page, and then a brush full of water pulled across the top, so that all the paint runs and flows down the page, because the page is at an angle of about 45 degrees, so that gravity is helping me to create these beautiful painterly effects in the sky. So then I can tip and tilt or turn my board any way that I want in order to control the flow of the paint and the water, keeping an eye on it and making sure that I like the look of the way the paint is flowing, wet in wet, and trying to sort of coax it with the brush and with the tipping and the tilting to produce the kind of sky that I want. Keeping it nice and straight across where the horizon line is, although once the paint has stopped running down in the middle, I shall put a sort of a light, shall lift out a line of light across the horizon, which hopefully will have quite a pleasing effect of separating the sea and the sky, although they're both going to be very similar colours. So I'm nearly there now. I've nearly got the paint running down and sort of merging and blending into that kind of sort of night, sort of single tone, if you know what I mean, of sort of a dark sky, but still with some glimmers of light in it, particularly close to the horizon. I've done most of the work with my Harkey brushes by Pro Art, nice large goat hair brushes, and that was my 3/4 inch Cotman flat brush, which I've just feathered through the sky just to add a bit of extra texture, and I can use it clean and damp to lift out, trying to keep it nice and straight, lift out a nice straight line of light between my sea and my sky. And I hope you notice that my board is now flat. As soon as I got the wash to the point where I wanted it to, where I liked the look of it, I laid it down flat, and then that means that the paint isn't going to run any further. It'll more or less dry the way it looks, and that was an ideal point for me to then put in or lift out my horizon line. And once it's completely dry, then I can paint on my fishing boat and my flock of seagulls. It's completely dry, and you can see that it's dried beautifully, a little bit lighter, sort of more luminous than it looked when it was wet. And this is the photograph from Pixabay that I've sort of cropped down a bit to focus on this fishing boat. Now, it's at quite an awkward perspective, sort of at a 45-degree angle to the viewer, going off into the distance. So it's actually foreshortened quite a lot, which makes it a bit awkward to draw and to make look convincing. So what I'm going to do is look at it carefully and sort of simplify it down into the most simplest shapes that I can see, sort of squinting my eyes at it just to see the tones and the shapes and just ignoring the detail. So I'm going to try and paint a boat by not painting a boat, but just trying to paint a few basic dark shadowy areas and then the lighter areas, and then putting in a few sort of details to hopefully bring the shape of the boat together. Now I hope that makes sense. You can of course paint a boat really carefully and exactly, take some time over it, maybe sketch it in first, but I think for loose painting I quite like the challenge of just painting in a few shapes, and if you get the proportions right and the tones right, then you can bring those shapes together so that they suggest the thing that you're trying to paint, and that's what I'm aiming for here. Now here the important thing is to get the shape of the hull right so that the viewer realises they're looking at the back of the boat, and also to have the boat sitting flat in the water. Even though it's going off towards sort of the top right corner, that's where it's headed, it still needs to be sat flat on the water, and then the reflection to be sort of pulled down from there in order for the perspective and the foreshortening to work. So by swapping between my calligraphy brush, my small calligraphy brush, and my 3/4 inch flat brush, I'm trying to build up these shapes by just taking the bare bones of what I see in the photograph of the boat, and instead of putting in a detailed cabin, I'm just putting a single stroke from the flat brush and then maybe darkening it up here and there, and then putting in the reflections exactly below the cabin, coming down just in a few sort of lines to sort of look like the reflections sort of against the slight ripples of the water, and then just using the tips of the flat brush and carefully painting in a bit of a mast, and then the small calligraphy brush will just put in a few little aerials and all those little strange details that you can see in the photograph of the fishing boat. So I'm just going to suggest them and suggest the detail on the deck with just a few sort of something and nothing brush strokes. It's somehow more convincing to paint a loose object or boat or building like this using these very sort of something and nothing brush strokes than it is to try and paint things exactly. And I hope you can see that from what started off as just a bit of a black blob, it's beginning to take shape, and that the foreshortened effect is beginning to look quite effective. Still a bit more work to do. I need to put some sort of shadows and reflections in the water, and for this I'll use the tips of my flat brush. It's my 3/4 inch flat brush and some sort of pale grey, just from the mixture of from the sky painting, and I'm just going to pull that from side to side here and there below the boat, and then slowly work on it, adding a few darks here and there, and then bring in some more darker areas. So eventually I should have a little bit of reflection because the water here is fairly calm, but also a sort of impression of the ripples that the boat has made as it's been travelling forward. And then swapping back to the small calligraphy brush just for sort of a wiggly vertical line coming down immediately below the mast. I'll let that dry and then come back and carry on with the water a bit later. And now for a few pops of my favourite sort of orangey red. It's a cheap vermilion from a discount art shop. I think the make is Royal Langanicle, I think, and it's such a great colour for things like buoys or details on boats, especially against very sort of grey blue scenes like this. So I'm just going to pop in those beautiful red pops of colour and just reflect them a little bit in the water as well. So there's just a slight hint of that glow from the lights on board the ship at nightfall. And then back to the flat brush and carrying on with the water, adding a slightly darker grey and pulling it back from side to side, but back towards the bottom left corner, so it suggests the motion of the boat as it travels through the water. Now just a couple more bits and bobs of sort of these little aerials sticking out of the mast, and then maybe a bit of rigging. Be brave, just use the very finest tip of your smallest detail brush or a rigger, and just bring a few lines down from the mast towards the boat, not too many, and if you use a very quick brush stroke, it's going to look a lot better and a lot fresher than if you painstakingly try to get it straight, because then it's almost inevitable that you'll get a wobble. So be confident, and I'm sure that your rigging will look absolutely fine. And then back in with an even darker mix of the colour and just darkening up the shadows in the water underneath where those ripples have gone in. Just bringing it over the tape so that when the tape's removed, we've still got that lovely sort of dark tone across the bottom left corner. And now for a few distant fishing boats on the horizon line, and I've mixed up a paler grey, and again using the small calligraphy brush, just going to very close to the horizon, just below there, just put in some sort of just little brush strokes really, and then some tiny masts. Couple on this side, then I'll put one on the other side, and I think that will do, and that will just help to give me a little bit of interest. It will just add to the scene. I'm making these much paler so that they look as if they are in the distance. I think they would stick out too much if you made them too dark. Paler things in the distance give you that sense of aerial perspective and recession. And if you get them a little bit too dark, you can get a tissue and just gently blot out a bit of the colour just before it dries. Now I think that's the boat nearly finished. I'm just going to put a bit more of that vermilion in the water just to sort of become reflected from that fender or buoy on the side of the fishing boat. And now for the tube consistency white gouache highlights. Just a dot here and a dot there, just to further draw attention to the fishing boat and make it look like the lights are just twinkling as it heads off home. Now just before I paint in the flock of gulls that are following the catch home and hoping for some scraps, I'm going to remove the border, the tape, and have a look at it with its clean white border, and that will help me to sort of see how the composition's working as a whole, and that will help guide me as to how many birds I put in order to keep the painting balanced. So I'm going to be putting these birds quite close to the boat, around the mast, behind it. As you often see at fishing ports, the gulls follow the boats in, because often the fishermen are preparing the catch as they travel back to the port, and are sort of, preparing and gutting some of the fish and tossing some over the side. And the gulls are all scrambling and scrabbling for a meal. So that's the kind of look that I'll be looking for. Being careful to make sure that I've got enough gulls to look convincing, that they're not too big, and that they sort of don't obscure the boat, but they still look as if they are flocking and flying and scrambling around the back of the boat, if you see what I mean. The other day I walked past a harbour nearby to me and saw a boat coming in exactly this way into the harbour, and the gulls, it was quite spectacular watching them following the boat. And that's the sort of look that I'm trying to get here. I'm starting off with just Payne's Grey and the small calligraphy brush, trying to make sure that I don't get them too dark. I'm going to sort of overlap some. I want their wings in different places. Different positions. So the wings are sort of pointing up like in a V, as if the birds are sort of flying down towards the sea, and some with their wings stretched out almost 180 degrees flat. Bringing a few up higher into the sky. They look a little bit lost at the moment, but don't worry, once we get the white gouache in, that should really bring the scene together. And we're going to have a few birds done just completely in white gouache. Against the dark sky and against the back of the boat, those white birds should really stand out and help to make the rest of this flock a lot more convincing. So adding a few touches of dark here and there to some of my birds before I go in with the white gouache. And now to bring the flock together with those touches of bright white. Not too many, because I want the right side of the painting to be very empty except for the distant boats. All the action's happening in this just about a third in from the left, and that's where our focal point is of the boat and the flock of gulls. So here we are, that's the finished flock, and if we zoom in, hopefully you can see that as loose birds they're reasonably effective. I think the white gouache really pulls them together, and I'm hoping that painting them loosely and roughly like this has given a real sense of sort of movement and sort of a cacophony of sound and movement as the gulls fight over the scraps. Well, I hope you found that helpful, and that you'll maybe try something similar for yourself. Please give us a thumbs up if you enjoyed the video, and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. And if you click on the bell icon, then you'll be notified each time I post, which is generally on Wednesdays and Saturdays. And thanks so much to my lovely Patreon group who support this channel. And I'll see you again soon, and happy painting. Bye.